Alright friends, host Eric here. I was talking with many people and after a bit of musing and soul searching, hello beach cock. And you happened to arrive just as I was beginning the video. I should make a video about argumentation, unless Beachcock wants to talk about something else. Anyway, in my years of being here and talking with famous people, I've had a lot of arguments with a lot of people. I'm also, as you may or may not know, a debate coach, and I've got a lot of experience in arguing. I consider myself an expert, like one of the most expert people I've encountered about argumentation. And I want to make people aware of how it works globally more. Like, for NTPs especially, or probably STPs as well, it's a finite set of shit. You know, somebody made this video the other day that I watched about, it's like a map of all of physics, how it all links together and stuff. How important is that? I totally wish all classes had done that first thing, you know. But anyway, here's some key things to think about with argumentation. My keyboard's broken. I got another keyboard. It broke too, like one day after I got it. So I'm a little frustrated with that right now. So I can't produce a document for you to look at here, but I'm going to go over it. I have a document that we can kind of go over too, but it's not organized the way I want to organize this video. So this is a lot of fucking waste of time at the beginning. Anyway, first thing to remember about argumentation is you're always arguing against another person. You're not arguing against positions that we tend to talk about ourselves as though we are. People issue positions, and then you argue against those positions in the context of arguing against that person. But the reason it's critical to remember that you're arguing against a person is because most of all meaningful argumentation is done in the linkage between multiple arguments. It's not done within a single argument chain. So a given argument might work well until a person is required to defend solvency or something, and then realize they don't have any arguments about solvency, and they fall apart. But so that's one thing to remember, is that we're arguing against people who make a sets of arguments. They don't just make single arguments. And those sets of arguments have to link back together and fit together appropriately, or else they're subject to critique. Second thing to remember is that affirming is different than negating. If you are in favor of something, it's a different kind of argument than if you are against something. The reason for this is because something your opponent establishes is not something you have to establish yourself, right? If my opponent says tariffs will save American jobs, or but I'm smart, I'm an ENTP, something like that, you don't have to establish that fact to do anything. They've established it for you, right? Presumably they want you to agree with it, and the most natural thing for you to do is disagree with it. So if you can agree with it and then use it against them in some fashion, you don't have to fight to make you don't have to establish anything. They've established it for you. So negating is different because the thing that's being addressed is not, it's not possible for it to be in dispute, what your opponent said, right? If that's what they actually said, if you wrote it down, recorded it, or whatever. The other reason negating is different is because affirming has a burden to affirm. It has a burden to substantiate the claim that's being made. Negating doesn't have the burden to substantiate any claims other than the claims that it makes in negating, because if the app fails to establish or substantiate what they're trying to establish, then we assume it's not so. In other words, if I say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm late to work again, but Bengal tigers attacked me on the way to work. And I was lucky to get away unscathed, no scratches or anything, but I was really delayed in getting away from them, running away and hiding, and they were after me for quite a while. Well, any sensible person is going to say, okay, if that is the case, I'm going to need to see some proof of this because it's too outlandish a story. You've been late too often, and I just don't believe it. And then the person has the opportunity to substantiate it. Well, I actually have video. These multiple passerbys took video of my many harrowing near-death experiences with this tiger. And then, the guy checks the news, and sure enough, there it is on the news. I'm being chased around by the tiger and all that kind of shit. Well, fine, it's established. It's been substantiated. And presumably explains why I'm late for work. The thing is, it's the asked burden to substantiate. You have no burden to believe that without proof, or any claim without proof, or any claim without substantiation. So, if I say I'm an ENTP, you can believe me if you want to. You can agree with me. You afford me the benefit of the doubt. You might think it's not in any dispute. There's no reason to dispute it. It seems pretty obviously so, or something like that. Or you might just leave it unresolved. Like, well, I don't know if he is or not. He says he is. I know he says he is. I can negate if I want, easily enough. He's affirmed it inadequately to convince me. That would be perfectly fine response. But if you say he affirmed it really well, I don't have any answers to any of the points he's made. I don't have any reason to disagree with any of those points. They're all standing. Then you should really adopt that position until you come up with reasons to negate. But regardless, doesn't matter. It just means to say you adopt a position means that you affirm it when opportunity presents itself, I guess. Okay, so affirming and negating are different. You debate people, not positions, although you do argue against positions and for positions and stuff like that. Argumentation always occurs on 4 levels. 4. There's the sentence level, contention level, framework level, and meta-framework level. The sentence level we don't usually talk about because it's really beginning stuff. It's like, well, a single argument is made up of a claim, a warrant, and an impact, which is the same thing as saying a statement that's being affirmed with a justification for why we ought to affirm it and a significance as to why it matters. So if I say I'm an ENTP, that's just a claim. There's no warrant or impact. I say I'm an ENTP because I match type description on 16personalities.com. And it matters because you're only hiring ENTPs, and I want you to hire me. It says on the application, it says on the job posting, only ENTPs will be considered. But it's important that I can convince you that I'm an ENTP. Okay, that has a claim, a warrant, and an impact now. The warrant is I match type description I read online. Not a very good warrant, but it's a warrant. So that's on a sentence level or on a single argument, isolation argument level. I'm an ENTP because I match this type description and it matters because I want to get this job and you're only hiring ENTPs. So, there's a couple of other elements to the argument than just, it doesn't break down into claim, warrant, impact like, milk is healthy. Milk is healthy because it has a lot of calcium, and calcium helps make strong bones. So your claim is milk is healthy, your warrant is calcium, your impact is stronger bones, being indicative of good health. So that's at the contention level. That's the simplest level. And if somebody presents an argument, quote unquote, that doesn't have a claim, warrant, and impact, then there's not a complete argument. Now, I guess on some warrants are impacts in and of themselves, depending on what kind of argument you're making. If you're saying we should ignore both of your arguments because they contradict each other and they rely upon each other for legitimizing the other one, then the warrant and the impact are, we should ignore it is the impact, and the warrant is you're contradicting yourself, and that the argument A relies on argument B to stand and yet contradicts argument B, is mutually exclusive of, and vice versa. You've double bound yourself, so to speak. You need A to get B, you need B to get A, and A and B are mutually exclusive. I just be double binding yourself, I guess. Okay. So you can see the arguments may all have claims, warrants, and impacts. The claim being, in that example right there, the claim being you've double bound yourself. The warrant being you need A to get B, and you need B to get A, and A and B are mutually exclusive. And the impact being we, the judge, presumably, third parties, both arguers, if they're playing fair, should ignore both arguments as a consequence because neither is substantiated. That would be the impact. So arguments do operate on that level in and of themselves. You can critique a given single argument chain by just simply saying there's no warrant there, or he hasn't established any meaningful impacts, so it doesn't matter. The second level is the contention level. At the contention level, you say things like the argument I made where you go, well, those two arguments contradict each other, blah, 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 blah. Now, that's an argument at the contention level because you're not saying anything about the frame or framework at all. You're just saying, he says here that Iraqi forces are particularly powerful, and that's why U.S. forces will be able to take over the city with their help with little U.S. cost. But in this other part here, he says Iraq's forces are dangerously weak and desperately need U.S. help. That's why we have to go help at all. He's trying to have it both ways. In that case, I'm not arguing that either of those arguments is bad independently. I'm saying that because they contradict each other, we should ignore both of them because he's put out contradictory arguments and he hasn't kicked either of them. If we're going to go back to considering either of them viable, he has to kick one of them first. Now, if they rely on each other, as I said in the previous example, then it wouldn't matter if he did kick one. It wouldn't do him any good. He'd lose both anyway. To kick an argument simply means to say, I'm no longer arguing that. You're right about that part. You can kick shit as long as it's not too interlinked, right? If you don't want to kick your foundation, or the whole house is going to tumble. So, after the contention level, framework. The framework is where you argue things like topicality. It doesn't matter whether he's right or wrong about this point because it's not topical. He's talking about what will happen in Burma if we do blah. But the topic is about what will happen in Argentina if we do blah, and he hasn't established that they're comparable enough. He hasn't established any comparability at all. He's just reading a card about Burma and hoping it applies to Argentina, but hasn't made any link or anything. Well, it's non-topical, and you shouldn't consider it in this as substantiation. So I'm critiquing in that instance by linking back to the meaning of the words in the resolution or the sentence that's being argued about. And ideally, in a well-argued argument, whether it's a formal debate or a street debate or whatever, people establish what is the sentence they are arguing about first, and let that sentence be argued out to conclusion before shifting ground on something else. So, if I'm linking back to the resolution, I'm linking back to what we're arguing about, I'm linking back to definitions and whether or not they're reasonable and stuff like that, then I'm arguing framework. Framework is basically ground argumentation. What constitutes legitimate ground? Is it legitimate to say that I won a debate that says we should substantially increase military engagement in the Muslim world by advocating a plan that we pass out pamphlets about military engagement? Is that adequate to say that we substantially increase military engagement? That would be a framework issue. If that's my advocacy, that let's substantially increase military engagement by passing out pamphlets about military engagement in various Muslim languages. Arabic, obviously, but different Muslim countries speak different languages. So anyway, if I were to advocate that advocacy, would that comprise a legitimate affirmation under the resolutional dictates that the United States ought to substantially increase military engagement in the Middle East? I would say no. That wouldn't qualify. That'd be what it's called squirrely, right? It's not really increasing military engagement. It's sending out pamphlets. You're trying to duck all the actual impacts of your advocacy. So in formal debate, in policy debate anyway, they give you a topic area, like the U.S. should substantially increase diplomatic engagement with China. And then the affirmatives have to come up with a specific plan. Well, this is how we should do that general topic area. And then the negation says, no, your plan's not going to work, or it's bad, or it'll cause nuclear war, or whatever. So that's a best kind of debate, really, because it requires somebody to advocate something sensible with the actual plan. And it requires the negation to nitpick it and try to knock down anything that is holding it up. Now, it used to be the policy debate was debated according to things that are called stock issues, or the shits: solvency, harms, inherency, topicality, and significance. So what that basically is does your plan solve the actual problem? Is the problem an actual problem, inherency? Are there actual barriers that you're eliminating with your plan? So a plan that you could say would have no inherency would be one that says, we should reduce crime, and my plan is everyone just be cool from now on. The thing is, it is a real problem, crime, but your plan doesn't have inherency because it doesn't remove any existing barriers to solvency in the status quo. It just says everyone be cool. Well, everyone could be cool already. It's not taking any steps to accomplish that, therefore it doesn't have any inherency. It doesn't have any solvency, perhaps you could say, as well, because it's not going to really solve the problem. But the real issue is that it doesn't have inherency. It's not removing any barriers in the status quo. So significance just means, okay, yes, you're helping the poor, but you're only giving every poor person a quarter of 1 cent every 10 years. That's not significant enough to bother with your plan. And topicality is what I discussed earlier, where it may or may not be topical. In other words, if the topic area says substantially increase and you increase it by a teeny fraction of an amount, even if it has significance, okay, then it doesn't matter because it doesn't meet the requirement of topicality. I can increase it this teeny little amount and cause these massive impacts. It doesn't matter if the resolution says substantially increase because you're not substantially increasing. diplomatic engagement. You're substantially increasing the outcomes from diplomatic engagement, maybe, but that's not what the topic says. So, significance is twofold, I guess, depending on what the resolution is. But they all kind of wrap in together in different ways. Harms is, you can think of it in terms of, what additional harm does your plan cause that are either unintentional or ancillary or unavoidable, but the side effects, do your net benefits outweigh the harms, or the harms just, are things that have to be addressed in a plan as well. So those are stock issues. And it's easy to remember them because it's SHITS, S-H-I-T-S, solvency, harms, inherency, topicality, significance. But we don't really debate with stock issues anymore, although certainly you can win debates with stock issues still. If you say that a given argument is not topical and their either negation or affirmation is relying on that argument standing, and you win the topicality argument, then you'll probably win the round. Some judges don't vote on T, some judges do. And we call it T in debate because topicality is such a stock issue that regardless of whether it gets debated as a stock issue, it gets debated anyway. People will run T on neg every round probably. They're going to run some kind of T argument. And a T argument always links to a word in the resolution. So T, you'll hear people go down a roadmap before a speech. They'll go, T it's, T substantially, T whatever, and they'll run topicality arguments on how the affirmative plan doesn't meet the topicality stipulations implied by the word it's, by the word substantially, by the word nation, by the word whatever, So those are all framework style issues. When you're dealing with topicality, when you're saying, well, this may be true, but it doesn't have enough significance to vote for them or stuff like that, that's framework. When you're saying prefer our framework over their framework, prefer our rights-based calculus over their utilitarian calculus, that's a framework issue. Meta framework is pretty popular these days. It's mostly, the basic definition of meta framework is anything that's pre-fiat. Now, fiat refers to the assumption the F has that they get to pretend like their plan passes so they can discuss what the impacts are going to be. In other words, the neg can't win by saying there's not enough political will to vote for your plan no matter how good it is. Because presumably we're debating about something because we're trying to make a decision about what we ought to do. And if the arguments are substantial enough and they win substantially enough, then presumably everybody will vote for that thing. Of course, it doesn't actually work like that, but that's the presumption behind fiat. Only the affirmative has fiat. The neg does not have fiat. However, they can borrow the AF's fiat. So, for example, I can run a counter plan on a neg, which says, if you go, well, we should deal with this. We should deal with this problem with Bluetooth connectivity. A lot of people are experiencing Bluetooth connectivity problems, let's say, in a given county. And the county government says, well, we should deal with this problem by making these new regulations requiring everybody to use a uniform Bluetooth standard or something like that. I don't know. And the neg goes, no, we should solve this problem by taking all the monies that would be required for enforcement of this and giving them to consumers to purchase their own Bluetooth solutions. Now, that would be an acceptable counterplan because it's not permable. To perm a plan or a counterplan means to permute it. Basically, it means do both. So, because my plan said, let's take all the money that would be spent implementing this law that you're going to spend on your proposed action, and let's instead take that money and cut that money into checks for the individual consumers who are having these connectivity issues and give them money directly. So you can't say permanently both because the money can only be spent once. And it's funded presumably according to a funding plank. And so as a consequence, they can't just go, well, we'll just fund it some other way. Nowadays, people don't usually fund with planks because they just go, well, we'll just spend tax revenue. We'll just increase taxes or whatever. Or we'll just take it from the general fund. Or we'll cut something else. It's like, and judges just let them get away with it. Anyway, that's not important. But the point is, in this example, counterplan, because they had a funding plank, it's not permeable. You can't do both. So in this instance, because it's exclusive and is topical without affirming. So let's say the affirmation says the topic area is something like electronics regulation should be increased in the county. And their plan is Bluetooth regulation. And the negation says, no, we should just cut them checks. Well, it doesn't affirm, right? It's not a different kind of regulation that would also be affirming the resolution. It's not an AF plan. It wouldn't pass topicality muster if you tried to make it into an AF plan because it's not increasing regulation. So as a consequence, it's a perfect neg counterplan. It doesn't affirm. It's mutually exclusive, so you can't perm it. And it's presumably preferable. It eliminates all the harms from the AF side. It presumably doesn't incur any harms on the neg side because you're not spending any more money. And generally speaking, pumping money into consumers' pockets directly is one of the few kinds of government programs that actually works because people spend it on shit and it pumps up the economy, pretty basic. Anyway, that would be a good neg counterplan. But the issue of counterplans, for example, is a meta-framework issue. So you might then say, he's running multiple conditional counterplans. So let's say I wasn't just running cut 'em a check. I'd say, I've got 3 counterplans, and they're all conditional. Either cut 'em a check, or if that one doesn't withstand scrutiny, then let's deregulate over here. And if that one doesn't withstand scrutiny, then counterplan C is let's invest all the money in research and development for a new technology to replace Bluetooth. So now I'm running 3 conditional counterplans. We should do A unless it loses to your rebuttals, in which case we should do B unless that loses as well your rebuttals, in which case we should do C. Now, in debate, people will run Kondo on that, which is a theory argument that says you shouldn't be allowed to run multiple conditional counterplans because there are infinite possible counterplans you could come up with in theory, and you're not addressing my plan at all. You're making it such so that I have to address all of your plans, and you don't even have to address my plan at all. And all you have to do is show that your counterplan is somehow better. That's the only way you have to address it, is to say that, just pick on the harms of my plan or something and say this doesn't have those harms. And you're going to make it such so that I can't spend any time defending my plan, and you're not going to spend any time attacking it. We're going to spend all our time talking about your counterplans. And as a consequence, that's not how we should be debating my affirmation. You're trying to turn my affirmation into your affirmation. And that's not how it should work. So most people would agree, in a formal debate round anyway, most judges would agree that you can only run one counterplan or two unconditional counterplans. So you can say, let's run both these counterplans, but they have to be unconditional. So if you're running both of them, then they both have to win. They both have to be necessary or significant part of the whole affair. There's not really any reason to run two unconditional counterplans. You might as well just run one. So that would be a meta framework issue. If you say you should vote for us, make this a reverse voter. They're running three conditional counterplans. They're trying to turn this into their affirmation. They're trying to avoid arguing about my AF plan entirely. They're running generics, blah, 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 blah. And, it's destructive to the notion of policy discourse because it's avoidant. They're not responsive, basically. So that's sort of like a how you argue argument, right? Other kinds of meta framework arguments are race case, things like, well, you should vote for me because I'm black, and slavery and everything, and so vote for me. You should vote for me because I'm poor. I had to ride the bus here. I don't have a laptop. You should vote for me. You should vote for me because I'm in an after-school program, and there's all kinds of discrimination against us by public schools. That's a fun one. Those are all pre-fiat, which means the AF. You should vote for me for reasons before the AF makes their fiated plan. Like, you should vote for me because, not because of anything having to do with their predicted impacts from their plan, but rather because they didn't use my preferred gender pronoun. Gender K is called. Those kind of arguments are called critiques, or K's in debate. It's spelled K-R-I-T-I-K, critic, but pronounced critique. And it's spelled the German way for some reason. I don't know. So people run race K's, cap K's, gender K's, performance K's. Performance K is about learning modalities. So it says, well, the best case for educational impacts, but again, it's pre-fiat impacts. Forget about your plan. You didn't sing and dance enough in this debate speech. That's a performance K. You can have AF Ks too, which is kind of nutty because they're almost never topical. And I vote on T, so. But, I mean, if you can get a topical AF K, fine. But an AF K that's topical would critique the resolution in some way. It would say it's like, we left the firm today because this resolution is poorly worded, and the only way we can solve this kind of problem is if in every round in these tournaments, AF always gets the vote because it's so skewed that it's impossible for an egg to win in general, and we have to make it clear this kind of resolutional mistake can't happen again in the future. There's a shell with a critique, so you've got to establish there's an alt, usually. And AFK, that's where they kind of fall apart. What's the alt? What could the neg have done differently, is what they're saying, is what's required by the alt. Now, neg case, it makes sense, right? Because you go, well, you could have not called me a nigger throughout the whole round, and then we would vote for you maybe. But since you did that, and it's so counter to civil discourse, then you should vote for us just on that. Forget about their plan. Forget about what happens post-fiat, after they fiat their plan, This is about discourse, ultimately, and that level of discourse shouldn't be rewarded by a win. So that would be like a discourse critique, and the alt is, well, the alternative is he could have referred to me as my opponent or that guy or something other than racial slur throughout the entire round. AFKs are kind of silly because they're made before they even heard anything from the neg speech. They can't really present a meaningful alt. How can the AF critique what the neg is doing when they haven't heard what the neg is doing yet? And the neg is responding to them. So instead, they have to critique the resolution. But a critique of the resolution, unless that critique itself affirms, doesn't seem to me a particularly meaningful critique, because it doesn't present the other side an alt. It tries to position it as this round was unwinnable before either team walked into the round. Like, for example, there was a Lincoln Douglas resolution that was something like it was a weirdly worded one. It was something like, this state of affairs ought to be worked towards ought to be engendered as a preferable outcome or something. It was really strangely worded in passive voice and stuff like that. And so back when Delilah was a sophomore or something, I had her run a NAID kit. It could have been made into an AF kit potentially. And it was about how we have to negate because it was a resolutional K. So what was the alt though for the AF on that resolutional K? It basically said this sentence has no truth value, so we have to negate because we can't affirm that it's true and it's a truth testing paradigm and all this sort of stuff. But there wasn't really an alt for the AF because it was a resolutional critique, not a critique of the affirmative behavior or argumentation. And if the other party says, well, listen, there's no alternative here, so you're basically saying before we walked into this round, the round was already lost by me. There's no way I could have done anything different or anything like that. But we both know that's not the case because throughout this tournament, people have won and lost on both sides. Af's not won all the rounds, Nave's not won all the rounds. If this argument were really so abundantly decisive, then everybody would be running it, and Af would always be winning, or Nate would always be winning, or whatever, And since you provide no alternative, you're basically trying to convince the judge that the framers of this resolution wished it to be interpreted such, or that it is most consistent with what we're doing here, that we interpret it as such that one side can't win the round and never had a chance to, and it couldn't have done anything differently to change the outcome. And since we all are in agreement that's not the case, you really need to provide an alternative then if you want it to be a meaningful critique. So anyway, but it was a neg resolutional critique that worked okay. She did better on neg than she did on half, if I remember correctly. She broke like quarters or something like that. So you've got basically a fairly limited set of possible kinds of arguments. You've got, and they stem from both what I call the terrain at the sentence level, the contention level, the framework level, or the meta-framework level. Arguments occur on a terrain when you're arguing against somebody, and each party's making sets of arguments anyway. They occur on a terrain, and then they also occur according to the type of sentence they are. So it's like, is this a predictive argument, a normative argument, a descriptive argument, or a prescriptive argument? Prescriptive being what's in our concrete TE style best interests, and descriptive being, is this actually how things are? Predictive being, is how likely is your predicted impact to come true based on your link chain? And then normative arguments are about what ought to be, or what's most just or moral, or something like that. So if you have a normative argument on a meta-framework level, then it's going to be something like, the only just thing to do is to vote for us because we're poor and black. If you have a normative argument on a framework level, you'd say, the resolution asks us to determine whether or not, deadly force against repeated victimizers utilizing domestic violence, use of deadly force by the victims of repeated domestic violence against their abuser is just. And my opponent is trying to say that it'll be an effective way of reducing the amount of domestic violence in the country without addressing the issue of justice. He refuses to answer the question of whether or not that's how he's determining justice. He simply says it will have this impact and that's sufficient to win in the round, and it's not. That would be a ground normative argument, basically saying you failed to make this normative, you're simply making it prescriptive, and that's inadequate to win. The contention level of normative argument is simply something like, we shouldn't do that because it's unjust. And at the sentence level, a normative argument is one that has ought or should in it, and specifically refers to ethical, moral, or right and wrong rather than benefits and harms. So the thing is, occasionally we do have descriptive arguments that come into clash with each other when two pieces of evidence conflict, for example, or when people just don't know something. Like, who was I arguing with the other day? I was arguing with something, I don't know. The point is, like, you might go like, no, that's not how it is. And I'll go, yes, it is. And then I'll find some card that I cut on and say, see? Yeah. Well, I don't know. Okay, well, that's how a lot of descriptive arguments are resolved. It's just a matter of one person learning something. But it's not the only way descriptive arguments are resolved. At least as often, probably, or almost as often, they're resolved by being rendered irrelevant in the larger scope of things. It doesn't matter who's right about this. It's a wash. We have to look to other matters now. So, if there's conflict about a given point, then how much impact that has depends on how central it is to other impactful argumentation in the round. So what I've talked today about are arguments, claims, warrants, impacts. I've talked about terrains, argument level, contention level, framework level, meta framework level. I've talked about types of arguments in terms of descriptive, prescriptive, predictive, normative. I've talked about critiques, which are meta-framework arguments that say ignore the advocacy and choose me for some other reason as the winner. We've talked about counterplans, which are kind of framework arguments, I guess, kind of meta-framework. I'm not really sure what to call them, but they're that to be a true counterplan, to a true counter-advocacy to an affirmative advocacy, needs to be mutually exclusive, needs to not affirm, and it needs to be preferable to the F plan. We talked about permutation, which is what happens if a counterplan doesn't have all those qualities. Then you simply can go, well, let's do both. Let's do our plan, then yours. Or let's do part of yours plus ours. Let's do ours first, but then let's do yours. Or, all those things are ways to permute in which you say, well, it doesn't matter. Your counterplan doesn't matter. It's not exclusive. It's not whatever. What else we talk about? Well, we talked about different kinds of Ks, going back to Ks briefly. We talked about performance Ks, race Ks, gender Ks, discourse Ks. I guess that's basically about it. Performance, race, gender, disability. There's disability critiques too. Capitalism critiques. I mean, like, for example, if A cap K simply says, capitalism's bad, your thing helps capitalism. A neo-lib critique says, neo-lib's bad, your thing's neo-lib. So those kind of critiques. There's an anthro K as well. That people run sometimes, which basically says, whatever's best for animals we should do. Or nature or whatever. There are other Ks. There's like, what's it called? What's his name? Kierkegaard, which basically says, yes, our plan caused a nuclear war, and that's good. It's an impact turn on suffering. We didn't talk about turns, but I'll get to that right now, and we'll wrap it up. So that's what we've talked about so far. Let's talk a little bit more about basic argumentation stuff like terms. And when you're answering something, there's a lot of different ways to answer a point. You can counter it directly, which says, no, you're wrong. I've got newer evidence that says it's no longer the case. Or, no, you're wrong because you create more harms than benefits, for example. That'd be called a disad. If you run a disad, okay, well, yes, your thing is going to cause X, but it's also going to cause Y, and Y is terrible. That's a disad. You say, no, your thing won't cause X. That's a direct counter, just a simple counter. You say, yes, your thing will cause X, and X is actually good. That's an impact turn. If you say, yes, your reason causes something, but it doesn't cause X, it causes not X, or it causes Y. Well, if it causes not X, then it actually, your thing doesn't actually increase X, it actually decreases X. That's called a link turn. And here's why, if you mitigate an argument, you're simply making it less significant. So you're saying, well, it's true, but it doesn't really matter. It's not as big a deal as he's making it out to be. That's mitigation. I just add is, again, if you say, well, yes, it causes your X, but it also causes this Y, which is terrible. If you say, you attack its topicality, you say, yes, this causes X, but it's not topical, so it doesn't matter. You could attack its presentation. Yes, it causes X, but you should have said it causes X. Therefore, you should lose. You could critique, you'd say, well, yes, it causes X, and X might seem like a good thing, but it actually supports capitalism. Capitalism is bad, so we should vote against it. That's just, cap K or something like that. Or you could run agent specificity on it or something. Where you go, X can't cause H can't cause X because H isn't an agent, and you haven't specified which agent is going to do this action, and the resolution requires it to be the U.S. federal government, and you haven't said which part of it is going to do it, or something like that. You could run vagueness. You haven't defined X clearly enough for it to be a meaningful impact of anything. You could run any number of things on it. But the point is that there are lots of different kinds of rebuttals, but there's a finite number of them. You basically answer it directly. You change the amount of impact. You change the location of the impact. Now I get all your impacts because I turned it. Or you render it on or off. So if you say it's not topical, it goes off. If you say it's factually false and you have better evidence or whatever, then it goes off. And it's not standing. Anything that's reliant on it is not standing either. So ultimately, that's the way argumentation works. It's like whenever anybody says something, they're necessarily opening to you link passages between the future things they say and that thing. And the trickiness of it, or the skill in it, I guess, or the talent in it, or whatever, is knowing how to build exactly the shape that makes this link to this in a toxic way rather than in a supporting way, so that they both fall apart. That requires some questions to be answered sometimes, You got to get people to pen down on shit. They don't like to answer questions, they want to be pinned down or whatever. But it's just life, It's people are avoidant, people are non-responsive. It's annoying. And people think that somehow I'm doing less, right? Like, well, Eric's just thinking about the arguments. He's not really thinking about the points. I've heard statements like that before. No. To the extent that there's a difference is that others are failing to understand that arguments and points are the same thing. I mean, whatever your point is, if it doesn't withstand argumentational scrutiny, it's a bad one. It's not substantiated. People will, well, that may win the argument, but that's not the best point. That just means you're thinking about it with your feelings. You feel like you want it to be that way. But if it were that way, it would be the strongest argument. So anyway, that's a little overview. I don't know, what did I not go over? I went over most things that are worth going over. I went over the stock issues. Different kinds of debate formats, obviously. Some are whole resolution focused, like public forum, where the AF gets a case and the neg gets a case. The neg case negates the resolution and the AF case affirms the resolution. And both teams get a chance to negate the other party's case. So it's a more balanced kind of debate, a little bit less AF leaning. In Lincoln Douglas, it's the AF has a case and the neg responds to it or does off case shit. And usually it's about half on, half off if you want to be successful in Lincoln Douglas. And off case stuff, it just refers to critiques, counter plans. That's it. Critiques and counter plans and theory arguments. Theory arguments basically being about what's okay to do in debate. Like, you fail to meet your burden to affirm is typically a theory argument. Although it's not when it gets argued, not in any dispute. So it's like, if I say he's failed to meet his burden to affirm, and it's correct, and my argumentation as to why he's failed to meet that burden withstand scrutiny, then we negate. I don't need to say, plus it's a really bad idea, he just failed to meet his burden is enough. If he makes all claims, no warrants, and no impacts, then he's failed to meet his burden. And that's all I should have to say. Okay, so theory arguments are also things like you shouldn't run multiple conditional counterplans. That's a theory argument. And we talked about counterplans, typical firms, talked about pretty much most of everything. I got a shallow level, but I guess I could say the way the framework works. If you have a proper debate, whether it's street or formal, both parties explicitly state their framework. It's not how it actually plays out most of the time. Most people don't state their framework explicitly, in which case they're implying a framework. If they have a mismatch of different kinds of arguments, then they're implying a mishmashy framework like cost-benefit analysis, which purports to include justice-minded things, but of course doesn't. Because if it did, it would prioritize those, not just include them. It's easy to prioritize justice when you feel like it. The thing is, if it's done right, both parties have a framework. If you win your framework, you win the prefer my framework arguments. So one side is going to win, my framework's better. But that doesn't necessarily mean they win the argument, the overall debate. Because let's say I'm arguing a rights-based framework, and I win the rights-based framework should be chosen. The other person's argument cost-benefit analysis. But the other person's one rights argument is actually stronger than my rights arguments, and he successfully rebuts my rights arguments, and his rights argument is standing, then he wins under my framework. He loses under his framework, but I won the prefer my framework argument, so he wins the round. If the prefer my framework arguments are a wash, then the judge is forced to go off of implied frameworks, basically. Probably won't vote for a rights thing because unless he thinks rights have the most real world impact, in which case maybe. So it's framework can be a tricky business. Most of the time, good debaters will always argue at the end of a round that they've won under both frameworks. However, even if you don't buy that, judge, and you think I only won under my framework, we should still prefer my framework. However, even if you don't prefer my framework, I won under his framework as well, so if you prefer his, I still win the round. Most good debaters will argue that at the end of just about every round. With justifications, obviously, they're not just saying those words and leaving that to suffice. The thing is, a really thorough debate takes 2 hours. It takes 2 hours and 4 people, 5 including the judge. That's that policy debate round. Because you've got, like 8 minutes to make your case on the aff, and there's a cross, then there's the first neg, then there's a cross, then there's a second aff, then there's a cross, then there's a second neg, then there's a third neg, then there's a third aff, then there's a fourth neg. It's like that. It's super long round. I don't remember the exact round structure. I always have to look that shit up. It's kind of like a weak SI, I guess, or something. Lincoln Douglas, I was going to look at the round structure. The only round structure I remember is PF because it's easy to remember. It's 4-4-2, 4-4-2, 4-4-3, 4-4-3, 2-2-3-2-2. 4-4-3, 4-4-3, 2-2-3-2-2. That's what it is. It's 2 opening speeches, 4 minutes each, then a cross, 3 minutes, cross fire. Not a cross-examination. Cross-fire, both people asking us questions willy-nilly. Cross-examination, one person asks, one person answers, and the person asking is in control of the cross. In other words, they can cut you off and say, okay, that's enough, next question, and you have to go along with it. But then you'll have your turn to do the same thing. So, crossfire, though, it doesn't work like that. It's just whoever, there's specific art to each kind of cross. Anyway, PF goes opening, crossfire, rebuttal, crossfire, summary, crossfire, grand crossfire, final focus. It's a nice symmetrical round structure. And it's whole resolution focused, like Lincoln Douglas's as well. Lincoln Douglas is one, I think it's fair to say also, that has the most available means of arguing different framework counterpoints, because typically it has a value and a value criterion. The value might be something like life or morality or autonomy or justice is not really a value, I don't think, because it's too much the point at issue, I guess. Value criterion might be something like respecting rule of law or protecting individual rights or something like that. And so you're really saying, look, because Lincoln Douglas is always, it's values debate, so it's technically always about what's right and wrong. And the top level value you're saying is, like, yes, we may harm autonomy, but we're protecting life, and ultimately life is the most important value. If you're dead, you can't enjoy any rights at all, and the sanctity of life is ultimately more important than quality of life, yada, yada, yada. And then A criterion purportedly is the best way to uphold that value. So you can attack on a criterion level. You can try to turn the value criterion and say, no, actually, upholding rule of law is harmful to your value. It doesn't uphold it, it undermines it. Or you can argue the value and you can say, we ought not prefer life, we ought to prefer autonomy, because life is not in and of itself a value. It's simply a or you could say something like it's an automatic until it's not. It's like protecting people's rights necessarily means protecting their lives, insofar as protecting people's rights or enforcing violations thereof has a deterrent effect on violations of rights, criminal violations of other people. So you can see how that works a little bit there. I guess that's about all I have to talk about for argumentation right now. I know I glossed over shit tons of stuff, but I think I got most of the big areas covered. It's probably a pretty long video. I've been yammering on about it for quite a while now. An hour, huh? Okay, well, I think I'm going to publish it and hopefully people like it. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to eat plenty of cheese.